Hello and welcome to this AWS webinar. My name's Ian Massingham. I'm a technical evangelist with Amazon Web Services based in Europe. I'm going to be your host for this session today. This session is one of our 3-series webinar which is intended to introduce new users to the Amazon Web Services cloud. And this is the first in the series entitled What is Cloud Computing with Amazon Web Services? Over the course of the next few weeks, we'll also share with you some content related to taking your first steps with the AWS cloud, and also a session on tricks and tips that you can use to optimize your costs when running IT workloads on the AWS platform. So please stay with us for the 3 webinars in this series. If you attend the first one, you will receive a follow-up email inviting you to attend sessions 2 and 3 over the course of the next few weeks. We have several other webinar series that we're also running this year. One called Journey Through the Cloud, which takes a solutions-orientated look at different AWS services, and again you'll receive a follow-up email about that. And then for more advanced users or users that are more familiar with AWS, we're also running our regular masterclass series webinars where we focus on individual AWS services and deep dive and hopefully show you how to get the most out of using those services, going beyond the basics into some more advanced use cases. The materials for this webinar, and in fact for all our webinars, are available from the download panel that you can see in the webinar interface in front of you. It's entitled Files, so you can grab a PDF of the webinar materials there. We'll also make the materials available on SlideShare immediately after the session. And if you have questions during today's webinar, we're not going to take questions live today because we've got a lot of content to get through, but you will see a Q&A panel in the webinar interface. If you'd like to submit any questions that you might have during the session today, myself or another member of our team will get back to you over the course of the next few days with answers to any questions that you may have. So please don't be shy, submit any questions that you've got and we will answer those for you over the course of the next few days. Also at the end of the webinar today, you'll be given an opportunity to rate this webinar. So we'll switch the interface slightly into Q&A mode, giving you an opportunity to submit any questions that we might not have answered during the session, and also giving you an opportunity to give us some feedback. And we'd love to get a feedback score from you on how good today's session has been at introducing you to the AWS cloud. You can score us from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest. Constantly trying to improve what we do here at AWS. It'd be really helpful for us to know how successful today's session has been at meeting that objective of introducing you to the AWS cloud. I'll also show you some social media links at the end of the session today that you can use to stay up to date with AWS, stay up to date with our webinar program, and also in-person events that we're running throughout the course of 2015. Okay, so let's get started. What is cloud computing with AWS? And there's 3 topics that we're going to cover during the session today. First of all, we're going to take a quick few minutes to introduce you to cloud computing, talk a little bit about the high-level benefits that customers can derive from using AWS. We'll then look at customers in more detail actually and take a look at some examples of customers that are using AWS today and work through some common use cases for organizations that are adopting the AWS cloud. What are the patterns that we see in the way that customers make use of AWS? And what are the typical journeys that customers go on when they start to use AWS for the first time? And then lastly, probably the longest section of today's session, we're then going to take a look at AWS Services and how you can use AWS Services to run your IT workloads. In fact, to develop, deploy and operate applications that you want to run, to be more specific. So what is cloud computing? It's a broad, deep platform that helps customers build sophisticated and scalable applications. So develop, deploy and operate your applications in the cloud, in the AWS cloud, and you'll find that you have a whole lot less to do in terms of managing and operating the technology that you need to support those applications, whether those are applications that are internal to your business, applications that might service your customers or partners, or they are in fact the product that your organization provides to its customers. You can use the AWS cloud to simplify, accelerate and lower the cost of delivering those applications to your internal and external users. So why are companies adopting cloud computing and AWS so quickly? At our AWS reInvent event last year in Las Vegas in November, we announced that we had over 1 million active users making use of the AWS cloud, and that's a lot of customers. So what is it that makes AWS attractive to these organizations, and why do organizations decide to adopt AWS? Why have so many organizations adopted AWS today? And if you talk to customers about that, the primary reason that they will give you for moving their IT applications and other IT workloads to AWS and the cloud generally is to do with agility. There's some fundamental characteristics of the cloud that just makes it a more agile platform upon which you can build and operate applications. And the 5 core tenets really of using AWS are that you can convert your CapEx to OpEx, you can lower your total cost of operations, whilst at the same time removing the need to guess the amount of capacity that you're going to need. This is by virtue of the elastic nature of the AWS cloud. You can defocus on things that don't really differentiate you that much, the undifferentiated heavy lifting of operating data centers, buying and operating server infrastructure, and buying and operating many of the software components that you might need to support your applications. You simply don't need to do that if you make use of AWS. And we have this consistent global platform that can enable you to rapidly change, expand or contract the geographic coverage area that you're going to support with your applications, placing them close to your users in different locations around the world. So those are the sort of 5 high-level areas of benefit that customers derive that contribute towards that improved agility. And we often talk to customers that are making good use of AWS, especially in more established companies that might not historically have been that innovative. And some of that restriction on innovation has been due to the inflexible nature of traditional IT. And what we hear back from customers is actually when they start making use of AWS, it makes them more innovative. They can experiment often and fail with, maybe without risk is a bit stretching it, but certainly with a much reduced risk profile in comparison to buying and operating IT with capital investment. This is something that we see leading to a lot of change in customers that are using AWS, that become more innovative and become culturally more innovative, experimenting often and failing without risk. So who's using AWS today and what are they using it for? You could say that AWS started with startups. A lot of the early adoption of the AWS cloud was amongst organizations that were building new applications. And that's changed significantly now. We have a lot of more established organizations making use of AWS, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. But for sure, many of the early adopters of the AWS cloud were startups, and you can find out much more about all of the customers that you can see on this slide. Yet all of these organizations are using AWS today. If you visit the URL that you can see at the bottom right of this slide, you can find video or written up case studies about every single one of the customers that you can see here, describing how they're making use of the AWS cloud today. We'll focus in on just one of these to talk about the benefits that you can derive, and we'll take a look at Airbnb. This is a very innovative marketplace business model, as you know, connecting individuals around the world that might have empty properties or space in their homes with people that want to buy accommodation in different cities around the world. So it's a marketplace connecting the supply side, which is the hosts, they call them, with the demand side, which is the guests. So people that want to stay in quirky or unusual properties, or actually for that matter in regular apartments in cities around the world, instead of using a traditional hotel booking site, can make use of Airbnb and can stay in some pretty quirky properties. I always say, if you look to London, close to where I'm from, you can find there accommodation in the form of canal boats. So you're not staying in an apartment or a house, you're staying on one of the canals in London, which I think is really innovative and really cool, actually. So it's a very large business today. They have over 200,000 people hosted on any given night, and it's a business which has grown very quickly. So they had little penetration really back in 2010, but the business has grown dramatically now, over 15 million guests by June 2014, and you can see that that growth rate is accelerating, if anything. So a very, very successful organization with many customers making use of the service. And that drives a significant amount of infrastructure. You can see here that in 2014, mid-2014, they had over 1,300 EC2 instances. So that's 1,300 virtual machines running in the AWS cloud that were supporting their application. So a pretty large platform. They also have over 50 terabytes of user-generated content. So these are photographs, reviews, that the guests will generate when they're staying in Airbnb properties around the world in order to inform other potential guests what their experience has been like. And if you talk to Airbnb about why they use AWS, It's a couple of things really. The first is they're using a broad range of AWS services, which removes some of the requirement for them to focus on that undifferentiated heavy lifting. Probably the most important word on this slide here is all relational databases. So they've been very disciplined, actually, Airbnb, about not doing things that can be delivered by using services from the AWS cloud. And that action of not doing things is an important aspect, actually, of getting value out of using cloud computing generally, but out of using AWS specifically, because it can allow you to focus your resources on doing things that are more core to your organization. You can see that Airbnb have been very successful about this, really, having only 5 people in their operations team managing those 1,300 EC2 instances, plus that 50 terabytes plus of user-generated content. Is a really phenomenally high ratio, way better than the traditional industry average for managing server infrastructure. And that efficiency allows Airbnb to focus more of their efforts on developing and maintaining, actually, the best and most distinctive experience for their customers. And that's what they regard as their core business, rather than operating their IT infrastructure. That's startups. Actually, as I said earlier, AWS is now getting significant usage and significant penetration into more established companies that have been around a little bit longer, and by virtue of that naturally have a more complex IT landscape than many startups. A lot more applications in use here, a lot of applications that might be considered legacy. And this usage amongst this broad range of different startups, which once again you can find much more details about if you check out that case study link that you can see at the bottom of this slide, has led us to observe a few patterns about the way in which more established companies tend to make use of the AWS cloud. What we see quite often is customers will start with development and testing workloads, and there's a couple of very good reasons that development and testing is a really good fit for operating on a cloud computing platform. The first is, of course, that development projects by their nature can be quite short term, so you may not have to have a development environment all the time. If this relates to a commercial off-the-shelf software package like Oracle or SAP or SharePoint, you can see some of the customers on this slide are using AWS for development and test operations around. You'll quite often find that these software vendors are releasing software updates every 1 to 2 to 3 years, and when they do so, you may need a large number of development environments in order to allow you to test, maybe update or modernize aspects of your application that are built on top of these application platforms. And that can lead to, in essence, having a lot of idle infrastructure for the rest of the time. And of course, by using the cloud, you can avoid that, simply having as many development environments as you need for the period that you need them, and paying for them only during that period. That's one of the reasons that AWS is a good fit for development and test workloads. Secondly, it's quite uncommon actually for development teams to work around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and there are further cost reductions available to you with AWS if you take the simple step of shutting down unused resources during the hours that they're not being used. This is applicable particularly, once again, to development and test environments where you may have your dev and test environment from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. during the working week, but have it shut down 12 hours a day overnight, and of course at weekends, which can take significant cost out of the operational cost for running those dev and test environments that you need. And you can see particularly Galata Chemicals having a really good impact on their operational costs for SAP development by using some of the approaches that I've just talked about there. So you see many customers using AWS in the first instance for development and test. It's also a good workload to learn about using the cloud with, because by its nature it's non-production. So it gives you an opportunity really to familiarize yourself with operating applications in the cloud without having any potential impact on customers, internal or external customers, in the event that you have any issues as you're learning about the differences between using cloud-based infrastructure and using your traditional dedicated private or on-premises infrastructure. That's the first set of workloads that we see customers frequently moving. After that, customers will often put applications into production on AWS that they've been developing, and we've got a very broad range, as you'll see here, of different types of customers in terms of segments and sectors, and also a pretty broad range of different application types that customers have deployed, from software as a service applications such as the Adobe Creative Cloud, through to high performance computing with Live Technologies, through to websites like the Qantas hotel booking website, or Vodafone Italy's SIM credit top-up application website which runs on the AWS cloud, or video streaming, or news distribution, or gaming. So a very broad range, new workloads that customers are choosing to put into production on AWS rather than on traditional IT infrastructure that they might own. We can categorize these really into three different categories. The first is websites and digital transformation. I already touched upon a couple of those there, but you can see we've got broad usage. Organizations like Lamborghini, Unilever, moving over 1,700 websites to the AWS cloud. They migrated 500 of those in less than 5 months, and that allowed them to reduce the time that it takes them to launch new websites by 75%. So very significant positive impact on Unilever's business. Through to publishers like Ziff Davis and even public sector organizations like the US Navy, making use of AWS to reduce the cost of running some of their web operations by around about 50%. So usage across all sectors and segments, as I already said. Another common area that we see customers using AWS for new applications is in the area of analytics. This has been a really big success actually. Some organisations, the Financial Times here in the UK, they introduced Amazon Redshift, which is our petabyte scale data warehouse, to allow them to enhance their analytics around their subscriber base, so they could learn more about how their subscribers were making use of their digital products. This is the online and mobile versions of the FT newspaper that they provide. They have around 450,000 subscribers for that. And actually, the CTO of the FT told me that they were a little bit concerned when they first implemented Amazon Redshift because they didn't think it was working. And the reason they didn't think it was working is because they observed a 98% performance improvement in running some of their queries on the new data warehouse that they'd implemented. So they had to double check these queries to make sure that the same results were being returned as were being returned from their pre-existing data warehouse, obviously much more slowly from that system. They ran the systems in parallel for a few weeks and determined that in fact, the AWS Amazon Redshift service was providing them with the same data. And the performance improvement was primarily due to the architecture of the Redshift product, the fact that it's a MPP columnar data warehouse, which can offer really significant performance for query-orientated workloads in comparison to using a traditional OLTP database engine for that sort of workload. And you can see we've got broad usage across a variety of customers for structured analytics workloads like the one I just talked about with the FT, but also many customers that are using our Elastic MapReduce, our EMR service, which is a managed service for running Hadoop workloads on the AWS cloud. And also customers, as I've said earlier, using us for high performance computing, people like Pfizer, not on the slide, but Novartis and others using AWS for large scale computational analysis of large data sets and for things like clinical trial simulations and others. So there's lots of use cases for running analytics workloads on the AWS cloud. And then lastly, in new applications, also see a lot of clustering around mobile apps. This is, again, due to a couple of reasons. Firstly, that mobile applications, actually very difficult to predict what level of usage you're going to get when you launch a mobile application. These are applications that are often made public in app stores, either the Android App Store, the Apple App Store, or of course the Kindle App Store on Amazon's own devices. And what you'll see here is that usage can be uncontrolled, which can mean you have two situations really. You can be in a negative situation because you might not have provisioned enough capacity to deal with the level of usage that your application sees, and the elastic nature of the cloud can help you cope with that much more simply. You can also be in a negative situation if you provision significantly more capacity than you require because you don't see the level of usage that you anticipate, which can leave you with financial overstretch. Well, once again, the AWS cloud can help you resolve that. The on-demand nature of the services, the fact that the services are commitment-free in many cases, means that you can dial down the amount of capacity that you have if you don't need it. This has led to almost ubiquitous use of the cloud for the delivery of the back end of mobile applications today. And AWS is powering many of these. Organizations like Qantas, Newsweek, HTC, Alcatel-Lucent making use of AWS to power mobile applications. And once again, you can find a lot more detail about these if you check out the solutions case studies section of the AWS website. So those are new apps. Those three categories are common. And then we're talking about hybrid architecture patterns where customers are adding cloud-based resources to applications that are already running. So this is supplementing existing workloads with the cloud. Customers like Nasdaq, SunPower, and Nokia all taking advantage of AWS to add functionality or add features, or in one case add compliance to pre-existing applications. Nasdaq producing data products using Amazon Web Services analytics products. Nokia optimizing their products using Redshift for analytics. And SunPower Corporation using AWS to provide a disaster recovery service in the cloud. Once again, the elastic nature of the cloud, the AWS cloud, means it's a very cost-effective place to run DR workloads. And SunPower are just one example of a customer that are doing that. We have other customers here in the UK. Haven Power, for example, a commercial power utility here in the UK, is using AWS to support its disaster recovery platform requirements. It's a very common use case for the AWS cloud. There's a reverse hybrid pattern where you have a large application infrastructure running in AWS. The case of Samsung Smart TV is a really good example of this. A large platform servicing their Smart Hub application within the Smart TV product, integrated back into Samsung data centers for financial transactions. So the majority of the application running in AWS, a small amount running back in the customer's own data centers. Then migration patterns, customers that are migrating existing applications to the AWS cloud. Unilever we already touched upon. Bristol Myers Squibb, another good example of a customer that's driving really significant performance improvement by making use of AWS. Here we're talking about high performance computing workloads for clinical trials simulation. They've got a 92% performance improvement in their workload. These workloads, these HPC workloads, by definition, they're already parallelized, so you can make really good use of large computing clusters inside the AWS cloud. You can also make use of purchasing options like the EC2 spot market, where you can buy computing capacity significantly reduced in comparison to the normal on-demand price. If you have some flexibility about when your workload runs, it might be a good purchasing option for you to investigate. And this is something that many of our HPC customers make use of. Bristol Myers Squibb, they managed to drive a 64% reduction in cost by making use of AWS for their HPC workload. So these are targeted migrations focusing on particular applications or on particular classes of application in these customers and others. And then you have horizontal migrations like this one that's been undertaken at the moment by News Corp, moving 3,000 applications to the AWS cloud. And interestingly, one of the key reasons that News Corp selected AWS was to do with visibility. So the APIs and, for example, the feature within AWS that enables you to tag resources and then analyze your billing on the basis of the tagging that you've applied gives News Corporation enhanced visibility of where their IT costs are being consumed, who in the organization, which applications, which projects, which business units are making use of IT services and to what extent. Something that is quite hard to identify with traditional IT infrastructure, where you might have to arbitrarily portion up capital investments that you're making. With AWS, you can tag and analyze your resources or the usage of those resources to give you really good visibility about where your costs are being consumed. And that's one of the key reasons that encouraged News Corp to migrate these applications to AWS. And then lastly, organizations that are simply getting out of the IT business, really. Netflix saying they have to be great at a number of things, but operating data centers is not one of those things. Kempinski, a hospitality management organization, not an IT services company. And Suncorp, a financial services organization from Australia, who are migrating a large number of applications to AWS and are really defocusing their efforts on that undifferentiated heavy lifting of operating the platform for their applications and focusing their efforts much more on the experience that their customers have through that application portfolio. So all-in migration is quite often the final evolutionary step of customers that started with development and test workloads and move through a cycle of familiarizing themselves with AWS, migrating applications, and realizing that yes, this is a robust, reliable and low-cost platform that we can use as a replacement for in-house IT. So that's a quick look at use cases. Let's move on now and take a look at AWS Services and how you can use those to run your workloads. And the first thing to say about this is we have a broad range of different services, over 40 different services. And if, like me, you've been in IT for a little while, there's a tendency to always think about IT in terms of what you knew. And for me, that was compute in the form of servers, storage, maybe in the form of enterprise storage arrays or DAS, CDNs for content distribution and content caching, persistent databases, and networking services like LAN switches or firewalls or load balancers. And you can see that those services are represented in AWS by those core services components that you can see near the bottom of the slide in blue here. And you can certainly consume AWS like that. You can use EC2 instances to run your compute workloads. You can use a variety of different services to store and retrieve or archive your data. But there are also higher level services that allow you to enhance security, control, visibility of AWS resources or resources that are within AWS. And even higher level services that comprise a platform upon which you can build analytics applications, you can deploy and manage your services, or you can build and scale mobile apps and enterprise applications on top of that you can use to enable your workforce to be more productive, to share and collaborate, and to communicate with one another. And I'd like to encourage you, really, if you're new to AWS, to try and think about the breadth of this stack and not spend all your time trying to map what you've known before into those primitives that you can see in that core services tier here, but rather to think about how you can make use of the broader range of services that AWS can provide to really transform the way in which you develop, deploy and operate your applications, because there are a lot of efficiency gains, a lot of speed gains, and a lot of reliability and security gains within your grasp if you can just think about things in a different way and transform your IT slightly more fundamentally than simply mapping across what you already have into AWS. Sure, you can do that. It will be reliable, probably more cost efficient than you have today, but there are still further gains available if you think more about the breadth of the stack. So we'll take a look at some of these services in detail, but I'd like to encourage you to open your mind and maybe think about this in a slightly different way. Second aspect of breadth is to do with geographic breadth. And AWS have 11 regions around the world. 9 of those regions are, if you like, standard regions that are publicly available, and there are a couple of special regions. One in the US called GovCloud, which is restricted to US government entities and entities that are sponsored for access by the US government. So if you are working with US government customers and you have to comply with federal information security standards, for example, and you can take a look at the AWS GovCloud for that use case. We also have a region in Beijing in China, which is slightly special because it requires a Chinese entity. You have to have a Chinese entity in order to operate there. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up for a preview of that region. And if you meet the criteria, you can be accepted for that preview, and then you can run applications and workloads in our Beijing region. But the other 9 regions around the world, they're publicly accessible with a single AWS account. And regions are quite interesting. They're not data centers. There's a kind of common misconception that you can map a data center to an AWS region. It's not the case. The regions themselves, they're constructed out of availability zones, and we currently have 28 availability zones around the world. So, for example, here in the EU West region in Ireland, we'd have 3 AZs or availability zones. In Frankfurt, which we announced and opened in October last year, we have 2 AZs or availability zones. And each availability zone comprises at least one physical facility, so at least one physical data center per AZ. So we have at least 28 data centers around the world. In practice, there's lots more than that because actually each AZ comprises between 1 and 6 data centers, but depending upon what the scale of usage is in that particular region. So you can distribute your applications across these availability zones. They're in separate failure domains then. So in the EU West and Ireland, you can spread your application across 3 AZs, be distributed across at least 3 physical facilities, at least 3 physical data centers. We connect them together with a high bandwidth, low latency network. And you can use that to build applications that have really good availability, scalability, and fault tolerance capabilities. We really like customers to take advantage of that. So we'll talk to you later about resources you can use to learn about how you can take advantage of some of these platform features. But the takeaway from this slide is regional breadth, as well as multiple facilities per region to allow you to build applications with good availability characteristics. In addition to that, we have these 53 edge locations. These are locations around the world where we provide our caching service, our content distribution networking service, CloudFront, and also where we have our DNS service, Route 53, distributed. And those will ensure that customers that are making use, your customers that are making use of the AWS platform, we'll get the best and most consistent user experience, best and most consistent access to content, best and most consistent DNS service for access to, say, API endpoints or applications that you might be running. So again, another important component of the AWS infrastructure that you can make use of as a customer. Built on that platform, on that infrastructure, we have compliance and security features, and these are really important features for customers, definitely a priority for customers, there's no question about that. And we spend a lot of time at AWS making sure that we comply with the compliance certifications that are important to our customers, things like ISO 27001, the Payment Card Industry Digital Security Standard, or PCI DSS. They're very important standards that our customers here in Europe tell us they need, and we have a host of other compliance standards that we comply with in North America and in other markets around the world as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this on the session today, but if you do want to learn more about compliance at AWS, visit awsamazon.com/compliance. You'll find a lot of information there, including details of how you can get hold of AWS compliance reports if you need that to comply with an audit or compliance requirement that your organization may have a statutory obligation to comply with. So do check out that part of the website if that's your case. And if you have any further questions about that, of course, you can submit questions via the Q&A panel in the webinar interface, so you can contact us via the website or speak to your account representative here at AWS. And we can help you out with any questions that you might have. Security is another important priority for customers, and if you take a look at the security model that AWS uses, you'll find that it's very familiar with the kind of familiar controls that you'll see probably within your own organization around physical, network, system, and people and process-based security. And this is a model that's been validated by some of the world's leading organizations, customers like Shell, Pfizer, GE, government entities like the CDC, NASA, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. They've all taken a look at the way in which AWS secures the platform that it operates and found that it's appropriate for them to run some of their security critical workloads inside AWS. So you can be confident really that some of the world's largest and most security conscious organizations have already reviewed the way in which AWS secures its services. And you'll find an extensive partner ecosystem that enables you to, in combination with AWS core features like the VPC, the Virtual Private Cloud, security groups, key management system, for example, enables you to create a security stance, in fact, a security infrastructure within AWS that is very, very similar to that which you might create inside a traditional data center infrastructure. And there's a kind of helpful quirk really of the cloud more generally that relates to security, which is this idea of the highest common denominator. Every time we have a customer that comes along and tells us they need a new security feature, maybe a new security service, has happened recently with our key management system, a service that's intended to make it easier for customers to manage the encryption keys that they use inside the AWS cloud. We implement that, and we can make it available to all customers. So you find that you can benefit from the stringent security needs of organizations like the ones that you can see on this slide. They're raising the bar of security products and standards that AWS will comply with, and every customer can benefit from that. So you can find out more about security AWS if you visit the security center at awsamazon.com/security. Moving on from these foundational infrastructure components to talk about specific services. Very quickly, we'll take a tour through some of the services that AWS provides so you can understand how you can use them to run your applications and other IT workloads. The first, maybe foundation service, is compute. So these are the virtual machines that you run inside the AWS cloud. We call those EC2 instances, EC2 being the Elastic Compute Cloud. It has adjacent or integrated services like auto-scaling and load balancing, so the ability for you to grow or shrink the pool of compute resources that you have in response to metrics, such as the amount of CPU that might be consumed, or the number of connections that you're currently handling, or the depth of a queue that you might need to process. And also to load balance network traffic across that pool of computing instances to service customer requests or to handle API requests that you might have. Those are tightly integrated services that work in concert with EC2 itself. And there's a broad range of different compute instance types available to you. General purpose, which have balanced amounts of CPU and memory. Compute optimized, which have proportionally higher CPU performance. Storage and I/O optimized, quite self-explanatory, with enhanced I/O performance or more storage attached to them. GPU enabled, giving you access to NVIDIA GPU floating point units for graphics rendering, computational fluid dynamics, or other floating point intensive workloads. And then memory optimized, which are of course a good place to run databases or other applications that might demand significantly more memory than they do CPU or I/O performance. And you can find those in the R3 series, the latest generation of the memory optimized instances. And we recently introduced something new, the C4, which is our latest generation of compute optimized instances. This pushes the envelope really in terms of scale and CPU performance, offering up to 36 vCPUs per instance and making use of a custom Intel Haswell CPU, which offers enhanced performance. Actually, with Turbo Boost, you can clock this CPU up to 3.5 gigahertz in certain circumstances. This offers you the lowest cost, highest performance place for you to run compute optimized workloads. These are EBS optimized by default, and we'll come to talk about what EBS is and what EBS optimization is later in this session today. But that's a new instance type. We announced that in November last year, and it just hit general availability in January 2015. We have a set of security, networking and access control services, as I've said earlier, allowing you to build a security posture in AWS that is at least as good as a security posture that you might have in your own infrastructure, potentially better, with tools like IAM, Identity and Access Management, CloudTrail that enables you to log and record and audit all access to your AWS API and then to use third-party tools to analyze that API access for incident management or fire events in the event that unusual API access is detected. Cloud HSM in conjunction with our key management service to enable you to manage, rotate encryption keys simply and easily inside the AWS cloud and integrate with other services, for example, to encrypt data at rest. Networking services like VPC that enables you to lay out your own network topology, use your own subnetting schema, connect or in fact not connect internet gateways or VPN gateways into a private area within the AWS cloud to permit or deny certain types of traffic or connect or disconnect certain networks that you may wish to allow or disallow access to your AWS resources. You can do all that with the VPC, the virtual private cloud, Route 53 for DNS. And Direct Connect, this is an interesting service that allows you to establish a low latency, high bandwidth direct connection from your data center or point of presence on your network straight into the AWS cloud to optimize performance and minimize latency for transferring large assets to AWS or allowing large communities of users to access services within the AWS cloud. You can do all that with the Direct Connect service in conjunction with Direct Connect partners around the world. Have a range of different storage services to allow you to securely and durably store and access data within the AWS cloud. One of the longest lived service, one of the most feature-rich actually is Amazon S3. This is a simple storage service. It's a highly durable and available cloud storage service that makes storage available via a HTTP or HTTPS API. And you can store and retrieve objects of up to 5 terabytes in size with 11 nines of durability and 99.95% availability inside S3, providing a very durable substrate really that you can use for many different purposes. It might be backup, it might be storing snapshots of information that you've got in EC2 instances, it might be storing information that you need to bootstrap your environment, it might be build artifacts that you're creating from a continuous integration system. All of these things can be stored in S3 and then they're reliably and durably available for use by customers or in other parts of your systems. Glacier is a service which is integrated with S3, offering extremely low cost, again very high durability with the same 11 nines of durability that you'll see in S3, a location that you can store data for the long term at very low cost. This costs about a third as much as Amazon S3. It has a slight latency in retrieval. It can take 3 to 5 hours to recover an object from Glacier or to retrieve an object from Glacier. But you can be secure that your information will be there, and it's integrated with S3 with things like lifecycle policies, allowing you to, for example, move data from S3 to Glacier after a 1 year period and retain it in Glacier for 10 years and delete it automatically at the end of that period. You can do all that without human interaction by making use of lifecycle policies, so a very powerful integrated service. EBS, these are persistent block storage volumes that you can attach to EC2 instances. You can think of them as virtual hard disks in the AWS cloud. We just announced some enhancements to EBS. offering general purpose SSDs, volumes of up to 16 terabytes in size, up to 10,000 IOPS and 160 megabytes of bandwidth. And on our provisioned IOPS service, the same 16 terabyte maximum volume size, but up to 20,000 IOPS and double the bandwidth at 320 megabytes per volume. And in conjunction with our EBS optimized instances, these are a great way to run I/O intensive, high performance applications inside AWS. For example, large scale relational databases are a great a use case that is greatly served by this kind of infrastructure. Large EBS volumes with provisioned IOPS running on EBS optimized instances, you'll find very good performance for that kind of workload with that combination of services. You can also run databases in the AWS cloud on a variety of different managed services. We have a relational database service called RDS, non-relational or NoSQL database called Amazon DynamoDB, and a caching tier called Amazon Elasticache, which should cover pretty much every data persistent use case that you have. RDS currently supports 4 engines: MySQL, Microsoft SQL, the Postgres engine, and the Oracle engine. And when using RDS, you'll find that the licensing costs for those commercial engines are included in the hourly cost of running your RDS instances. So if you only need databases for a short period of time, it can be a way to access licensing, which is very, very cost effective. And of course, you can use resource reservations with RDS in the form of reserved instances to optimize your costs if you do run a database for a long period of time. This is a topic that we'll return to much more extensively in the third webinar in this series, where we focus on cost optimization. But these resource reservations are available actually for a variety of different AWS services and are a way to reduce your costs. DynamoDB provision throughput, so you dial in the number of database operations per second you wish to access on your DynamoDB table. We will provision that for you. You're accessing DynamoDB via either the Amazon Web Services API or from one of the SDKs that we provide. You can write to it directly from mobile devices and read from it directly from mobile devices using our mobile SDKs, for example. And Elasticache, as I've said already, is a caching tier that can be used to accelerate the performance of relational databases using Memcached or Redis within your infrastructure to accelerate performance and actually reduce the size of RDS instances that you may need to run in performance critical situations. Once again, another cost optimization opportunity that you've got. And we recently announced a 5th engine for RDS called Amazon Aurora. This is a commercial grade database engine which will be delivered at open source costs. It's MySQL compatible. It offers 5 times better performance than standard MySQL, has a different durability model where data is replicated across different availability zones, meaning that failover of the environment between AZs, if you make use of our multi-AZ feature, should perform significantly better than MySQL as well. It's highly scalable and secure, and this will be available also through Amazon RDS, so provisioned in the same way as an existing RDS instance as an additional engine that you can select. We're currently in preview with this service. It'll be available later in 2015. So that's also a new innovation that we recently announced. Then on analytics, so for non-online transaction processing workloads, for query-oriented workloads, or for dealing with large big data sets, Hadoop through Amazon Elastic MapReduce, dealing with real-time data with Amazon Kinesis, our managed data stream management service, data warehousing with Amazon Redshift, and data workflows with our data pipeline service. We're not going to cover those in depth today, but if you are interested in running analytics workloads on the AWS cloud, why don't you submit a question via the Q&A in the webinar interface, and our team will provide you with some further references. We'll also be running masterclass series webinars later this year that focus on a number of these analytics services in much, much more depth. Application services, tools that application developers can use to accelerate the speed at which they deliver applications with rich functionality, and also make their applications more scalable and easier to maintain. Things like decoupling with our SQS queuing service, workflow orchestration with our simple workflow service, app streaming with Amazon AppStream, enabling you to run applications in the cloud which are graphics intensive and stream those into lightweight client devices like laptops or tablets, video and audio transcoding with the Elastic Transcoder, email with simple email service, and search with cloud search. So a variety of different app services that you can make use of. We also announced at reInvent last year something called AWS Lambda, which is an event-driven computing service. This is a new computing model for running applications in the AWS cloud, taking events from AWS services or custom events that you may trigger, using those to fire cloud functions. At the moment we support JavaScript here, so you write and upload your cloud function, an event will trigger that and will automatically provision the compute memory resources that are required in order for you to execute your code inside the AWS cloud each time it is triggered, without you having to provision EC2 instances, or for that matter provision any infrastructure in order to achieve that. It's a higher level application service that developers can use to build loosely coupled event-driven applications. And customers are already finding use cases for things like IoT applications, image transcoding, other event-driven applications as well. So you can find more details about that on the AWS website, and we'll cover that in later webinars again later this year. And as I said earlier, one of the key ways that customers maximize the value that they get from AWS is to make use of deployment and management tools. Well, that's container management services like the EC2 container service, another service which is still in preview, enabling you to run Docker containers on AWS at scale with much reduced overhead. DevOps tools like OpsWorks, for example, enabling you to use Chef to provision and control AWS resources, resource templating with CloudFormation, usage tracking with CloudWatch, and monitoring and logs with CloudWatch logs. You may want to take a look at these services. These are some of the most valuable services that AWS provides, and with one exception, which is CloudWatch, they're at no cost. So you can make use of these development and management services and only pay for the AWS resources that you consume. And the mobile application services, mentioned briefly earlier in today's session, but we have a portfolio of services that make it easier for mobile developers to work with AWS resources. Identity with Amazon Cognito, Amazon Mobile Analytics, enabling you to track usage and see who's doing what inside your applications. Our mobile SDKs, as I've already mentioned, allowing you to work directly with AWS resources and services from within mobile apps using SDKs for the Android, iOS, and Fire platform. And SNS push notifications, allowing you to reliably deliver push notifications at high volume to a very broad portfolio of different mobile devices, including Windows Mobile and the Beidou notifier in China. So if you're interested in building mobile apps, once again, we'll have further webinars later in the year that focus on this in more detail. And applications for enterprises, I mentioned earlier, productivity applications to enable customers to access virtual desktops in the AWS, and for collaboration and sharing with things like Amazon WorkDocs, the new name for Amazon Zocalo, our service that allows users to share and collaborate on documents, and Amazon Workmail, our recently announced email services, allowing administrators to avoid the heavy lifting of operating email infrastructure and take that from AWS on a simple per user per month commercial model. Very, very cost effective as well. So find more detail about those on the AWS website, of course. And integration with on-premises resources is something that we focus on a lot, whether that's integrated networking with VPC, whether it's integrated access control with SAML federation of roles and groups into AWS's IAM service, whether it's integrated backups with the storage gateway acting as a VTL device, or customers using the API on S3 or on Glacier with third-party backup software, whether it's providing customers with a single pane of glass for management of your Amazon Web Services resources within VMware's vCenter portal or within Microsoft's System Center Operations Manager. We're trying to improve the opportunity that customers have to integrate AWS resources with on-premises IT. And once again, if you're interested in digging into any of those topic areas in more detail, please ask a question via the Q&A panel in the webinar interface, and our team will provide you with some further detail about any or all of those integration points. And actually, if you think you can identify other integration points which AWS have not yet addressed, that's something we'd like to hear about as well. We're very keen to get feedback on feature requests and things that we could be doing better. And one of the reasons for this is to do with our innovation model. The way in which we develop new services here at AWS, I think, is quite distinctive. We believe in operating an organizational model with small teams. We call them two pizza teams because they're never too big to be fed by, or never so big that they need more than two pizzas to be fed at lunch or dinner. There's small autonomous teams, therefore, by definition. And these teams have roadmap ownership. They have direct conversations with their customers that drive their roadmap. And we have a decoupled launch model where we try to get core functionality into the hands of customers as quickly as we can, focusing on operational stability, high scalability, but quite often having a limited feature set. And then we'll iterate on the basis of customer feedback. So if you have feedback about anything we're doing, or maybe more importantly, things we're not doing, then please let us know. We can feed that into our two pizza teams that might be working on those particular services or particular scope areas that you're interested in. And 90 to 95% of our innovation comes directly from customer feature requests. Customers saying, wouldn't it be good if the service did this? And once we get enough customers saying, wouldn't it be good if the service did this? We'll, of course, work to integrate that into the services feature set and release that as an enhancement. We've done a lot of this over the years where we are rapidly iterating and launching new services. Back in 2014, the year just gone, we launched over 500 new services and new features. And you can see there on this slide on the far right, just the new services that we announced. And there was a very broad range of different services announced, from enterprise collaboration, mobile services, services for application lifecycle management, services to enhance governance in the enterprise environment, things like the key management service and the service catalog, and of course AWS Lambda and that container management service for running Docker workloads on AWS. And we want to do the same in 2015. So if you've got new services that you feel we should be working on, or enhancements that you feel we could make to existing, please let us know, and we can of course add that to our roadmap and start working on those things. And one of the nice quirks of the cloud really is that when we do release innovations, when we do release new features, you don't have to do anything in order to take advantage of them. The upgrades happen automatically to the platform, and you can immediately start taking advantage of those new features when they're released. Things like the C4 instances that we made available in January 2015. Customers were immediately able to stop and start their instances and take advantage of higher performance and lower cost for compute-intensive workloads. So this is a characteristic really of having these platform services where AWS carries the heavy lifting of maintaining and upgrading the feature set. You don't have to do that in the way that you do with on-premises infrastructure. We also extend this into price innovation, where we're looking to lower costs, basically by launching services that customers find value in, so they will use them. That helps drive usage on our platform, which means we need more infrastructure. We can use that to drive economies of scale through the platform, lower infrastructure costs, reduce prices to you, which in turn helps us acquire more customers, and so that cycle begins again. That's a flywheel that we try to spin here at AWS. We're very focused on trying to minimize the cost that customers spend on services with us, with tools like AWS Trusted Advisor. You can find out more about that in the support center of the AWS website if you're interested. So that's the content we have for you today. Some next steps that you can take. First thing to say is there's a free tier for Amazon Web Services. So if you're not currently a customer, you sign up for an account, you'll find you get a year's worth of AWS services that you can use at no cost. AWSamazon.com/free. You'll find details about precisely which services are included, but it's basically everything we have, with one or two exceptions, but basically everything we have. And you can make use, for example, of 750 hours per month of instance time on Linux and 750 hours per month on Windows. And that's not just one instance running for a whole month. You know, if you wanted to try something that involved running 5 or 6 instances for a few days, but it didn't total more than 750 hours of each instance type, you're perfectly able to do that. So it's the aggregate total number of hours that counts. And the majority of other services are included as well. So take a look at the free tier and please do experiment. You know, you can learn a lot about AWS by experimenting with the services that we have available in the free tier. If you do have a more substantial migration project, or you're thinking about deploying an application on AWS, before you do that, please take a look at the Architecture Center, AWSamazon.com/architecture. There's around about 40 different architectural patterns that we've developed and made available through the Architecture Center that will really get you started with best practice deployment models for common applications. Don't reinvent the wheel. I always say that, but don't reinvent the wheel. Take a look at what's already been done, good practice that we've managed to synthesize from customers that we've worked with around the world, document and make available in the Architecture Center. You may find we've already created a pattern that will support a workload that you have, or we've already created 90% of what you're looking for. So please make use of that resource. It's a very valuable resource. If you are interested in working with AWS, but you either don't have or don't want to develop the expertise in-house, we have a broad range of systems integrators that work with us, from global organizations like Accenture, CSC and Capgemini, through to local consulting partners. Here in the UK, we have consulting partners like Smart 421, CloudReach, and others that have done some very substantial work with AWS customers to help them realize the benefits of the AWS cloud. Did you know, for example, here in the UK, that the National Rail Inquiry's Journey Planner, one of the largest distributed systems in transport here in the UK, was migrated to the AWS cloud by Smart 421, one of our partners here. So there's great examples of very, very complex applications where customers are benefiting from AWS as a result of working with our systems integration and consulting partners. If that's a model that you're interested in, take a look at awsamazon.com/partners. You can learn more about who's in the ecosystem. Maybe you're in an organization that would like to become an AWS partner. There's information at that same website address about how you can register and qualify as an AWS partner as well. And while we're on the theme of partners, ISVs, there's many ISVs that have packaged software products and made them available in the AWS marketplace, or have certified them to run on the AWS cloud. Organizations like NetApp, Twilio, Adobe, Microsoft, Oracle, Citrix, Infor, all got products that are available either in the AWS marketplace or are supported on the AWS cloud. So if you want to deploy a new application, take a look at the marketplace, and you may find that you're able to experiment or even run an application in production from the AWS marketplace in just a couple of clicks, provisioning the application together with the AWS resource that's required to run that application in a very, very simple and easy to use way, and paying for both the software and the resources that are required to run it through your AWS bill. So take a look at the marketplace if you're interested in using ISV products on the AWS cloud. Okay, so we've given you a quick tour around AWS today. If you're interested in more hands-on experience, maybe training, maybe certification on AWS, we have a training and certification program. The URLs for this are available on this slide. And of course, the materials, as I've already said, will be available for download. You'll receive an email after the session today with a link to a SlideShare where you can access the materials, downloading them in PDF format or viewing them online. And also a link to a YouTube video which will have a recording of this webinar if you want to re-watch it or share it with anyone else in your organization. You're obviously free to do that. And as I said earlier, we're going to switch the webinar interface into Q&A now, and we'd love you to rate the webinar today. So please give us a score between 1 and 5, 5 being the best. If there are any questions that we have not covered during the session today, then please submit those to us via the Q&A panel in the webinar interface. We will get back to you over the course of the next few days with an answer. Our answers normally include additional resources, pointers to places on the website, third parties, products perhaps even, that can help you address the question that you've asked. And if you want to enter into a dialogue with us, of course, you can reply to those questions when we send your answers out, and we'll connect you with a member of our solutions architecture or our account management team that can help you follow up the questions to the level of depth that you need in order to make sure that everything you've asked us has been answered to your satisfaction. Okay, so that ends the session for today. I'll leave this slide up and leave the webinar open for a few minutes. We would like you to follow us on social media. We will keep you up to date with our webinar program, also our live events around the UK. And if you follow us at AWS Cloud, you can stay up to date with AWS global news and announcements. So new services, new customer case studies, how-to documentation, large events that we might be running around the world, like our reInvent event, which will come up later this year. And of course, you can find me on Twitter as well if you're interested in staying up with the life of an AWS evangelist. Also, I tend to share a lot of information about AWS user groups here in the UK and elsewhere here in Europe. So if you're interested in participating in the AWS user community, maybe learning directly from other AWS customers, then user groups can be a really good vehicle for that. And you can find out more about those on my Twitter at Ian as well. Okay, thanks for your time. Really appreciate you joining us today. We'll leave the webinar open. If you have questions that you'd like to submit, please go ahead and do that. We'll get back to you over the course of the next few days. Thank you. Bye-bye.